January in Chicago didn't whisper, it roared against the Penthouse's panoramic windows like a living thing demanding entry. Inside the Fray residence, the air was purified, climate-controlled to an exacting 71 degrees, carrying the faint scent of leather furniture and the antiseptic emptiness of a home that had forgotten how to be lived in. Kenny Fray stood at his standing desk in the corner office, the glow of market tickers painting shadows across his face. At 38, he commanded shipping routes that spanned 3 continents, a man who could redirect cargo ships with a phone call. But within these walls, he was a specter haunting his own life. Since they'd lowered his wife into the ground 14 months ago, the penthouse had become less a home and more a mausoleum with Wi-Fi. He managed his household the way he managed his empire, through screens and distance. "Richard's bath time done?" He would text. "All done, Mr. Fray," Brandy would reply. Brandy Clegg moved through the marble hallways like someone practiced in the art of invisibility. At 29, her eyes held stories she'd learned to keep locked away, stories most people never bothered to ask about because they never really looked at her. The crisp uniform she wore wasn't just clothing, it was camouflage, a way to blend into the background of other people's lives. She was here for the paycheck, for the stability, and to outrun a past that still had teeth. In the nursery, painted in soft grays and whites, 18-month-old Richard slept in his designer crib, wisps of dark hair, pudgy fingers curled in sleep, the only pulse of real life in this temperature-controlled tower. Brandy stepped into the nursery for her final check before clocking out. The room felt wrong, immediately, something in the quality of the stillness. She moved to the crib, reached down to adjust the organic cotton blanket, her hand hovering over Richard's tiny chest. Her breath caught in her throat. His chest wasn't rising. His lips held a tinge of blue that hadn't been there 30 minutes ago. "Richard?" She breathed, her voice barely audible. Nothing. Not the soft inhale-exhale of infant sleep, but the crushing, suffocating nothing of a room where a child had stopped breathing. The baby monitor didn't go dark, it was the sudden flatness of the breathing pattern graph, the absence of that reassuring green wave, that turned Brandy Clegg's blood to ice. In that crystallized second on the 47th floor, she wasn't a maid with a tragic past, she was the only barrier between a billionaire's last piece of joy and an unspeakable void. Brandy Clegg had learned to measure her life in increments of silence. The kind of silence that came with careful footsteps on Italian marble, with doors closed so softly the latch barely clicked, with questions swallowed before they could form on her lips. This penthouse on the 47th floor wasn't just her workplace, it was a masterclass in erasure, in making yourself small enough to fit into the negative spaces of someone else's grief. She'd been here for 8 months now, ever since the agency had called with the placement. "High-profile family," they'd said, their voices tight with the kind of discretion that came with 7-figure households. "Recently bereaved. Young child. They need someone with a steady hand and a closed mouth." Brandy had both. She also had a mountain of student debt, a landlord who didn't accept apologies in place of rent, and a past she was desperate to seal behind a door marked "Do Not Enter." The penthouse itself was a monument to controlled perfection. 4,200 square feet of glass, steel, and limestone that floated above Chicago like a spaceship hovering over the mere mortals below. Every surface gleamed. Every corner met at a precise 90 degrees. The furniture was the kind that appeared in architectural magazines with price tags that made Brandy's stomach twist. A sofa that cost more than her car, rugs hand-woven by artisans whose names she'd never be able to pronounce. It was beautiful, in the way a museum was beautiful, untouchable, bloodless, designed to be admired from a respectful distance. Kenny Fray occupied this space like a man haunting his own life. Brandy rarely saw him in person, maybe twice a week. Always in passing, always with his phone pressed to his ear or his eyes fixed on whatever screen was nearest. He was tall, trim in that way that came from expensive personal trainers and meals that were nutritionally optimized rather than enjoyed. His suits probably cost more than she made in a month. His watch definitely did. But it was his eyes that told the real story. Gray-blue and rimmed with the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix. They carried the weight of a man who'd built an empire and then watched the only thing that mattered slip through his fingers while he was busy moving freight across oceans. His wife, Melissa, from the photos that still lined the hallway, had been vivid and warm, her smile the kind that lit up a room. The kind of woman who probably made this cold tower feel like a home. She died suddenly, an aneurysm that gave no warning and took no prisoners. One moment she was planning Richard's first birthday party, the next she was gone. Kenny hadn't recovered. Brandy doubted he was even trying. Their interactions were clinical, transactional. He communicated primarily through the household management app, a sleek piece of software that turned human needs into push notifications. Richard's schedule? He'd text at 6 in the morning. Pediatrician confirmed for Thursday. She'd respond. Any fever? No, Mr. Fray. Temperature normal. Eating well. The messages had the warmth of a medical chart. Sometimes she wondered if he knew what color his son's eyes were turning as they shifted from infant blue to something more permanent. Sometimes she wondered if he'd held the boy in the last week. But she didn't ask. Asking wasn't in her job description, and she needed this job the way a drowning person needs air. Brandy had been someone once. Not just a woman in a charcoal uniform who restocked organic baby food and sanitized silicone teething toys, but someone with letters after her name, someone with a future that glittered like the city lights beyond these windows. She'd been 2 years into her medical residency at Cook County, the kind of doctor who chose the ER because she liked the chaos, the split-second decisions, the way you could pull someone back from the edge if you were fast enough and brave enough and refused to accept that death got the final say. Then came the incident. A patient. A mistake that wasn't hers. A system that needed a scapegoat and found one in the young black resident who didn't have the pedigree or the connections to fight back. The hospital's legal team had been efficient, brutal. Her medical license suspended pending investigation, an investigation that moved with all the urgency of continental drift. Her loans didn't wait. Her rent didn't wait. Her life didn't wait. So now she folded organic cotton onesies and sterilized bottle nipples and tried not to think about the fact that she'd once held a scalpel in the same hands that now pushed a $1,000 stroller through Lincoln Park. Richard was the light in this mausoleum. 18 months old, with his mother's dark curls and his father's serious expression that would crack into a gummy smile when Brandy played peekaboo or made silly voices while reading Goodnight Moon for the 14th time that week. He was hitting his milestones right on schedule, babbling, cruising along furniture, showing the first signs of wanting to walk. He had a laugh that was pure joy, the kind of sound that seemed impossible in this silent tower. Brandy had started to love him, which was dangerous. Dangerous because this wasn't her child, wasn't her life, wasn't permanent. Dangerous because she'd learned the hard way that loving something meant giving it the power to destroy you when it was taken away. But Richard would reach his chubby arms up to her in the morning, his face breaking into that smile, and her heart would do something stupid and hopeful in her chest. She'd catch herself sometimes, standing in the nursery while Richard napped, just watching the rise and fall of his chest, the flutter of his eyelids as he dreamed whatever it was that babies dreamed about. In those moments, she'd think about Kenny Fray in his office 30 feet away, staring at shipping manifests while his son slept. She'd think about how grief could turn you into a stranger in your own life, how fear could make you build walls so high you couldn't see what you were protecting anymore. Kenny was afraid. She could see it in the way he avoided the nursery, in the way he'd leave instructions through the app rather than walk down the hall, in the way he'd hired a full-time nanny for a child who lived in the same home as his father. He was terrified of losing Richard the way he'd lost Melissa, so terrified that he'd chosen to lose him preemptively, to keep the boy at arm's length where grief couldn't reach. It was the saddest thing Brandy had ever seen, and she'd seen plenty. The routine was immaculate, clockwork. 6:30 wake up, bottle, playtime. 8 o'clock breakfast, organic oatmeal, fruit cut into age-appropriate pieces. 9 o'clock stroller walk through the private park area if weather permitted, indoor play if it didn't. 11:30 lunch. Noon nap. 2:30 snack. 3 o'clock developmental activities blocks, books, supervised exploration. 5 o'clock dinner. 6 o'clock bath. 7 o'clock bottle and bedtime routine. Brandy documented everything in the app, every meal, every nap duration, every diaper change, every minor milestone. Kenny would read the reports, she knew. He just wouldn't participate in them. Sometimes, on her way out for the evening, she'd pass his study and see him silhouetted against the windows, phone pressed to his ear, barking orders in Mandarin or German or whatever language his global empire required that day. He was moving mountains. He was reshaping supply chains. He was making decisions that affected thousands of jobs and millions of dollars. And 20 feet away, his son was learning to say mama to a woman who wasn't his mother and would never be allowed to be. The golden cage, Brandy thought, worked both ways. She was trapped by necessity, by debt, by a past that had been stolen from her. But Kenny Fray was trapped too, imprisoned by fear in a tower of his own making, unable to reach through the bars he'd built even though the door had no lock. Neither of them could have known that everything was about to change, that the careful distance they'd both maintained was about to be shattered by the worst kind of silence, the kind that came when a child's breath simply stopped. The afternoon had been routine until it wasn't. Brandy was in the kitchen, preparing Richard's 3 o'clock snack: organic strawberries cut into quarters, a small bowl of hummus, whole grain crackers arranged on the divided plate that made meals look like an art project. The baby monitor sat on the counter beside her, its screen showing Richard's sleeping form in soft gray tones, the reassuring green wave of his breathing pattern undulating across the bottom of the display like a heartbeat made visible. She was reaching for the sippy cup when the wave went flat. Not irregular, not erratic, just flat. A straight green line where there should have been peaks and valleys, the digital representation of breath reduced to nothing. Brandy's hands froze. Her medical training kicked in before her conscious mind could catch up that instantaneous shift from civilian to clinician, the way her body knew what to do even as her heart rate spiked. She was moving before she'd made the decision to move, the monitor forgotten on the counter, her feet carrying her down the hallway in long strides that were just shy of running. The nursery door was already open. She'd left it that way, the way she always did during nap time. The room was dim, blackout curtains filtering the afternoon sun into a soft twilight. The white noise machine hummed its oceanic lullaby. Everything looked normal. Everything was wrong. Richard lay in his crib exactly as she'd left him 20 minutes ago, on his back, his favorite blanket tucked loosely around his legs. But his chest wasn't moving. His lips had taken on a dusky blue tinge that made her stomach drop through the floor. His skin had the waxy pallor of insufficient oxygen. Richard. Her voice came out steady, clinical. She was already lifting him, already assessing. No breath sounds. No chest rise. Skin cool to the touch, but not cold minutes, not hours. Airway potentially obstructed. She swept his mouth with her finger, nothing. Tilted his head back slightly, checked again. Clear. She laid him on the changing table, the firm surface better than the crib mattress. 2 fingers on his tiny chest, just below the nipple line. 30 compressions, fast and shallow, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. Her other hand fumbled for her phone, hit 911, wedged it between her shoulder and ear. 911, what's your emergency? 18-month-old male, not breathing, no pulse. I'm performing CPR. We need paramedics immediately. Her voice was calm, automatic, the voice of someone who'd made these calls before in another life. She rattled off the address while her hands kept working. 30 compressions. 2 breaths, her mouth covering his nose and mouth. Gentle puffs, because infant lungs were the size of her fist. Watching for chest rise. Again. 30 compressions. Ma'am, are you trained in CPR? Yes. Former medical resident. Compressions are effective. No response yet. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. Come on, baby. Come on. Paramedics are en route. There's a significant weather event causing delays. Current ETA 15 to 20 minutes. 15 minutes. In a pediatric code, 15 minutes was an eternity. 15 minutes was the difference between a save and a statistic. She heard footsteps in the hallway, running. Kenny appeared in the doorway, his face drained of color, his phone still clutched in his hand. He'd been in his study. He must have heard her voice, the urgency in it cutting through his closed door. What he couldn't finish the sentence. He was staring at his son, at Brandy's hands on his son's chest, at the blue tinge of Richard's lips. He's not breathing. I've called 911. I need you to go downstairs and wait for the paramedics. Flag them down. We can't afford any delay. She didn't look up. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. Go. Now. Kenny stood frozen for another second, then turned and ran. She heard his footsteps retreating, heard the elevator doors chime open. 2 minutes of CPR. 3. Richard's color wasn't improving. His chest rose with her breaths, but fell. Slack. No independent respiratory effort. Her mind was racing through possibilities: sudden infant death syndrome, cardiac event, seizure, aspiration she'd somehow missed. But the why didn't matter right now. The only thing that mattered was getting oxygen to his brain, keeping his heart pumping until the real cavalry arrived. For minutes. 5. Outside. The wind had picked up, howling against the windows. The weather report that morning had mentioned a cold front, possible snow. The kind of January storm that turned Lake Shore Drive into a parking lot. She could do more. The thought crystallized in her mind with perfect clarity. She had done more, in another life, in an ER when a child had come in just like this. An unorthodox technique, something she'd learned from an attending who'd trained in Australia, a modified version of a procedure that wasn't in the standard textbooks. High risk, high reward. The kind of thing that could save a life or end a career if it went wrong. She didn't have a career anymore. But Richard might not have a life if she didn't act. Her hands remembered what her conscious mind was still debating. She shifted her position, tilted Richard's head back further, opening the airway to its maximum. Then she placed her thumbs on either side of his throat, just above the collarbone, and applied pressure not to the trachea, but to the vagus nerve, a precise compression that could sometimes shock an unresponsive system back into autonomic function. It was a technique used for certain types of pediatric arrhythmias, a way to reset the heart's electrical system without drugs or defibrillation. She held the pressure for 5 seconds, released, delivered 2 rescue breaths, then repeated the vagal maneuver. Press, hold, release, breathe. Her hands were steady, even though her heart was hammering against her ribs. This was the kind of thing that could go catastrophically wrong. This was the kind of thing that got you sued for practicing medicine without a license, for performing procedures outside your scope, for playing God with someone else's child. But Richard's lips were blue and the paramedics were still 10 minutes away, and she'd sworn an oath once, even if the system had stripped her of the right to honor it. Press, hold, release, breathe. Richard's body jerked. Not much, just a small spasm, but it was something. She continued the compressions, the breaths, the vagal stimulation. Another jerk. Then impossibly, miraculously a gasp. A tiny, shuddering inhalation that was the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard. His chest rose on its own. Fell. Rose again. The blue began to fade from his lips, replaced by pink. His eyelids fluttered. Another breath, stronger this time. His hand moved, fingers curling and uncurling. Brandy sat back on her heels, her hands shaking now that the crisis had passed, adrenaline flooding her system with nowhere to go. Richard was breathing. Irregular, shallow, but breathing. She rolled him into the recovery position, keeping his airway open, monitoring his color. Pink was returning to his cheeks. His respiratory rate was increasing, finding its rhythm. The elevator chimed. Footsteps thundered down the hall, Kenny returning with 3 paramedics in winter gear, carrying cases of equipment, moving with practiced efficiency. We've got it from here, the lead paramedic said, already kneeling beside the changing table, already assessing. Good work. You kept him viable. Viable. Such a clinical word for a child who was alive because someone had refused to let him die. They worked quickly, professionally. Oxygen mask. For line. Cardiac monitor showing a rhythm that was fast but steady. They asked her questions when she'd found him, what she'd done, how long he'd been unresponsive. She answered in the same clinical shorthand, doctor to paramedic, even though she had no right to that language anymore. Kenny stood in the doorway, his face ashen, watching them load his son onto a gurney that looked comically large for such a small body. He hadn't said a word since he'd returned with the paramedics. He was staring at Brandy with an expression she couldn't read: shock, maybe, or the beginning of questions that would reshape everything. We're taking him to Northwestern, the lead paramedic said. You can follow in your own vehicle. He's stable now, but we need to determine the cause. They were moving toward the door, the gurney between them. Richard's eyes still closed, but his chest rising and falling with beautiful, terrible regularity. Kenny moved to follow them, then stopped, turned back to Brandy. What did you do? His voice was hoarse. I saw that wasn't just CPR. What did you do to him? Brandy met his eyes. Her hands had finally stopped shaking. I saved his life, Mr. Fray. We can discuss the specifics later. Right now, you need to be with your son. He stared at her for another long moment, then nodded and followed the paramedics out. The apartment fell silent except for the wind against the windows and the white noise machine still humming its useless lullaby in the empty nursery. Brandy stood alone in the room where a child had died and been brought back, her past and present colliding in the small body of an 18-month-old boy who would never know how close he'd come to the edge. Outside, the snow had started to fall. Northwestern Memorial's pediatric intensive care unit existed in a state of controlled urgency. All beeping monitors and hushed voices and that particular smell of antiseptic that never quite masked the underlying scent of fear. Brandy sat in the waiting room on a chair designed by someone who'd never had to sit through a vigil, her uniform still on, a cold cup of coffee growing a skin on the table beside her. She'd been there for 6 hours. No one had told her she could leave. Kenny was inside with Richard, had been since they'd arrived. Through the small window in the picket doors, Brandy could catch glimpses of him, a shadow beside a too-small bed, a silhouette that never moved. The doctors had stabilized Richard within the first hour, but he hadn't woken up. Induced coma, they'd said, medical terminology for we're keeping him under until we understand what happened and why. Tests were being run. Specialists were being consulted. The machinery of modern medicine was doing what it did best, reducing a child to a series of numbers and scans and lab values that might eventually tell a story. Brandy knew that story from both sides now. She'd been the one reading the charts, making the calls, explaining to terrified parents that their child's fate hung in a balance measured in arterial blood gases and neurological responses. Now she was on the other side of that conversation, except she wasn't family, wasn't anything really, just the help who'd happened to know how to keep a child's heart beating until the professionals arrived. A nurse had brought her the coffee hours ago, along with a question that felt more like an interrogation. So you have medical training? Brandy had answered carefully, truthfully, aware that every word was probably being documented somewhere. I was a resident. Before. The nurse had nodded and left, and Brandy had understood that the clock was already ticking on a different kind of emergency, the legal kind. The kind that came when someone without a license performed procedures that lived in the gray area between Good Samaritan and practicing medicine. She should leave. Should go home. Let the family handle family business. Return to her role as the woman who prepared organic snacks and documented diaper changes. But her feet wouldn't move. Richard was in there, small and silent, and walking away felt like abandoning him even though he had a father, had doctors, had everything money could buy except the certainty that he'd open his eyes again. Kenny emerged from the PICU at 9:30, moving like a man who'd aged a decade in an afternoon. His suit jacket was gone, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his tie loosened into a noose he'd forgotten to remove. He saw Brandy and stopped, and something complicated crossed his face. Exhaustion, confusion, and underneath it all, the sharp edge of suspicion beginning to take shape. You're still here. It wasn't quite a question. I wanted to know he was okay. Kenny moved to the coffee station, poured himself a cup he didn't drink, stood with his back to her. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, controlled. The doctors want to know exactly what you did. They said his heart rhythm showed signs of vagal stimulation. They said that's not standard CPR. It's not. They said it's a technique that requires specific training. Advanced pediatric life support. The kind of thing a paramedic might know. Or a doctor. He turned to face her. You told me you were a nanny. I am a nanny. That's not an answer. His eyes were red-rimmed, but sharp, that billionaire focus narrowing down to a single point. Who are you? What aren't you telling me? Brandy had known this conversation was coming from the moment she'd placed her thumbs on Richard's throat and performed a procedure she had no legal right to perform. She'd made a choice in that nursery, and choices had consequences. She could lie, could deflect, could try to minimize what she'd done. Or she could tell him the truth and let the chips fall where they would. I was a medical resident, she said. Emergency medicine. Cook County Hospital. I was 2 years in when my license was suspended. The silence that followed was heavy enough to have weight. Kenny's expression shifted through several configurations. Surprise, calculation, the beginning of something that might have been anger or might have been fear. Suspended. For what? For something I didn't do. The words came out flat, stripped of emotion through repetition. She'd told this story to lawyers, to board members, to the agency that had placed her in the Fray household with a background check that mentioned none of it. A patient died. There was a medication error. The attending physician who made the error said I administered the drug. I didn't. But I was the resident, and residents don't win those fights. Kenny was staring at her with an intensity that made her want to look away, but she held his gaze. So you've been in my house for 8 months, taking care of my son, with a suspended medical license, and you didn't think that was something I should know? The agency cleared me. I passed every background check. The suspension is pending investigation, not revocation. I'm not barred from childcare. Her voice was steady, but her hands were gripping the arms of the chair hard enough to hurt. And today, Mr. Fray, that suspended license saved your son's life. The words hung between them like a blade. Kenny's jaw worked, his hands curling into fists at his sides. Or maybe whatever you did to him caused this in the first place. Maybe this is why you're not a doctor anymore. The accusation hit her like a physical blow, but she'd been expecting it. Of course he'd go there. Of course he'd look for someone to blame. And she was convenient. She was there. She was the person who'd had her hands on his child when everything went wrong. The paramedics have the timeline, she said quietly. I found him not breathing. I called 911 immediately. I performed CPR according to protocol. The vagal maneuver was a last resort because he wasn't responding and the ambulance was delayed by the weather. You can review the 911 call. You can talk to the paramedics. They'll tell you the same thing. Kenny turned away, pressed his palms against the wall, his head bowed. His shoulders were shaking. It took Brandy a moment to realize he was crying, silent, controlled, the kind of tears that came from a man who'd forgotten how to let himself break. I wasn't there, he said, his voice muffled. I was 30 feet away, and I didn't know. I didn't hear the monitor. I didn't check on him. I was on a conference call about shipping containers, and my son was dying, and I didn't know. Brandy stood, moved closer, but not too close. You couldn't have known. It was a medical event. It wasn't. Don't. He straightened, wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, turned to face her. The tears had left tracks on his face, but his expression was hardening, that billionaire armor sliding back into place. I'm going to have you investigated. Properly. I'm going to find out everything about you, what happened at Cook County, why you lost your license, whether there's anything in your past that put my son at risk. I understand. And if I find out you're responsible for any of this, if there's even a possibility that you caused this, I will bury you. I will use every resource I have to make sure you never work again, never, Mr. Fray. A doctor appeared in the doorway, a woman in her 50s with gray streaks in her dark hair, and the kind of calm authority that came from decades of delivering bad news. We have the preliminary results. Kenny's face went white. Is he? The doctor continued. Richard is stable. The coma is medically induced, and will begin reducing sedation tomorrow if his numbers continue to improve. The doctor glanced at Brandy, then back to Kenny. But we need to discuss what happened. Can we speak privately? Kenny looked at Brandy, and in that moment she saw it all playing out. Her dismissal, her investigation, possibly her arrest, depending on what the hospital decided to do about her unlicensed intervention. She'd saved a child's life, and it was going to cost her everything she had left. She stays, Kenny said. Whatever you have to say, she needs to hear it. The doctor nodded, consulted her tablet. Richard experienced a severe hypoglycemic event. His blood sugar dropped to dangerous levels, triggering a seizure that stopped his breathing. It's rare in children his age, but not unheard of. We're running additional tests to determine if there's an underlying metabolic disorder. Hypoglycemia. Kenny's voice was hollow. Low blood sugar. Critically low. Another few minutes without intervention, and we'd be having a very different conversation. The doctor looked at Brandy. The paramedics said you performed vagal stimulation. That's what restarted his autonomous breathing. It was unorthodox, but it's also the reason he's alive. The silence that followed was absolute. Kenny was staring at Brandy like he was seeing her for the first time. This woman in a charcoal uniform who'd been invisible for 8 months and who had suddenly become the only reason his son still had a future. I'm still going to investigate you, he said finally. I need to know who you are. Really are. I know. He nodded, turned back to the doctor. When can I see him? Now, if you'd like. We're keeping visiting limited, but you're his father. You can stay as long as you need. Kenny moved toward the picadors, then stopped. Brandy. He didn't turn around. Thank you. For whatever it's worth, thank you. Then he was gone, and Brandy was alone again with the cold coffee and the uncomfortable chair and the knowledge that her past was about to become very public, very quickly. Kenny Fray had the resources to dig up everything. The patient who died, the medication error, the way the system had closed ranks around the attending physician and hung her out to dry. He'd find the newspaper articles, the medical board hearings, the career that had been destroyed not because she'd done anything wrong, but because she'd been convenient and disposable. And maybe, just maybe, he'd find the truth that the board had refused to see. That she'd been good at her job. That she'd cared about her patients. That the only thing she'd been guilty of was being in the wrong place with the wrong skin color and the wrong last name when someone needed a scapegoat. Outside the windows, the snow had stopped. The city glittered in the dark, a million lights pretending the world was simple and beautiful. Brandy settled back into her chair and waited for whatever came next. Richard opened his eyes on the third day, a slow flutter of dark lashes that Kenny almost missed because he'd been staring at his phone, trying to read an email that kept blurring in front of his exhausted vision. One moment his son was a small, still figure lost in a nest of wires and tubes, and the next those eyes were open, confused and frightened but undeniably awake, undeniably alive. Kenny dropped the phone. It clattered against the linoleum, forgotten. "Richard. Hey, buddy. It's okay. Daddy's here." His voice cracked on the last word, and he reached for his son's hand, so small it disappeared entirely in his grip. Richard's fingers curled weakly around his thumb, and Kenny felt something break open in his chest, some dam he'd been holding against the flood of terror and guilt and desperate love he'd been drowning in for 72 hours. The nurses came quickly, summoned by the change in the monitors. The doctor followed, performing the assessments that would determine if the boy who'd opened his eyes was still fully Richard or some diminished version, if the minutes without oxygen had stolen something essential. But Richard tracked movement with his eyes, squeezed hands on command, even managed a weak sound that might have been da-da or might have been random vocalization, but was the most beautiful thing Kenny had ever heard. Neurologically intact, the doctor pronounced, and Kenny felt his legs go weak with relief. "We'll continue monitoring, but initial signs are excellent. He's young enough that his brain has significant plasticity. The intervention was fast enough. He should make a full recovery." Should. The word was a caveat, a hedge, the way doctors never promised anything absolute. But it was more than Kenny had dared hope for 3 days ago when they'd wheeled his blue-lipped son through emergency room doors. Brandy heard the news from a nurse in the waiting room where she'd been appearing in shifts, staying for a few hours, leaving when Kenny emerged for updates, returning when he went back inside. She'd been dismissed gently, formally, with 2 weeks severance pay and a letter from Kenny's attorney thanking her for her service, but she kept coming back anyway, unable to stay away, needing to know that Richard would be okay. "He's awake," the nurse said, smiling. "Responsive and alert. It's a good sign." Brandy's eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall in public. "Thank you for telling me." She should go home. She'd been fired, paid off, officially severed from the Fray household. Her apartment was waiting, as were the bills that 2 weeks severance wouldn't begin to cover. But Richard was awake, and that was the only thing that mattered. She'd saved him. Whatever came next, she'd saved him. What came next arrived in the form of a certified letter delivered to her apartment 4 days later. Northwestern Memorial Hospital was requesting her presence at a medical board review. The language was formal, cold, full of phrases like unauthorized medical intervention and unlicensed practice and potential liability concerns. She was being investigated for performing the vagal stimulation, for exceeding the bounds of Good Samaritan protection, for practicing medicine without a valid license. The review board met in a conference room that smelled of furniture polish and recycled air. 5 people sat across a polished table, 3 doctors, a hospital attorney, and a representative from the state medical board. Brandy sat alone on her side, unable to afford a lawyer, facing down the same institutional machinery that had already destroyed her career once. Ms. Clegg, the lead doctor, a man with silver-haired and the kind of face that suggested he'd never made a mistake in his life, opened a folder thick with documents. "You performed a medical procedure on a minor child while your medical license remains suspended. You understand this is a serious matter. I understand that a child wasn't breathing, and I did what was necessary to save his life. You performed vagal nerve stimulation, a procedure that requires specialized training and, more importantly, a valid medical license. You had neither the authority nor the legal standing to make that intervention. I had the training. I had the knowledge. And I had 18 months of knowing that child, of caring for him every day. What I didn't have was time to wait for someone with the proper credentials to arrive and find him already dead." The attorney leaned forward. The hospital has significant liability concerns. If your intervention had caused harm, but it didn't. Brandy's voice was sharp. It saved his life. The paramedics confirmed it. The attending physician confirmed it. Richard Fray is alive and neurologically intact because I refused to let him die while I waited for permission to help him. The legal system doesn't work on outcomes alone, the silver-haired doctor said. If every suspended medical professional decided they could intervene in emergencies based on their own judgment, then maybe more children would survive. Brandy stood, her chair scraping against the floor. You want to revoke my license permanently? Fine. You already destroyed my career once for something I didn't do. Destroying it again for something I did do, something that saved a life, seems about par for the course. She left before they could respond, before the tears could start, before they could see how much it cost her to walk away from the profession she'd loved with her whole heart. Kenny learned about the hospital board review from his attorney, who'd been keeping tabs on the situation as part of the investigation Kenny had ordered into Brandy's background. The investigation had been thorough, exhaustive, expensive. What it had found was a story that made Kenny sick with anger at a system he'd never had to navigate personally. Brandy Clegg had been an exemplary medical student. Top 15% of her class. Glowing recommendations. She'd chosen emergency medicine because she wanted to help people in their most vulnerable moments. She'd been 2 years into her residency when Dr. Marcus Hammond, a 20-year attending physician with connections throughout Chicago's medical community, had made a medication error that killed a patient. An error he'd blamed on his black female resident, who had no powerful family connections and no union protection. The hospital had investigated internally, which was to say, they protected their investment in Hammond and sacrificed the resident. Brandy's medical license had been suspended pending a state board review that had been mysteriously delayed for over 2 years, trapped in bureaucratic limbo while she drowned in student debt and worked whatever jobs would have her. She'd done nothing wrong except be the convenient target. And now she was being punished again, this time for saving Kenny's son. The attorney who delivered the report also delivered a warning. The hospital is making noise about pressing charges. Practicing medicine without a license is a felony in Illinois. They're worried about liability, about setting precedent. If you stand by Ms. Clegg publicly, it could reflect poorly on your corporate reputation. Kenny sat in his office. The report spread across his desk, Richard's laughter drifting from the nursery where a new nanny, temporary, inadequate, wrong, was trying to engage him with toys he barely noticed. His son was alive. His son was home. His son asked for B multiple times a day, his toddler pronunciation of Brandy's name, not understanding why she didn't come when he called. Corporate reputation. The phrase tasted like ash. Kenny had built his empire on logistics, on moving things efficiently from point A to point B, on reducing human complications to algorithmic problems. But the woman who'd saved his son wasn't a logistics problem. She was a person who'd been crushed by a system that valued reputation over justice, convenience over truth. He could protect his reputation. He could distance himself from Brandy, let the hospital board do what it would, move on with his life while she faced felony charges for saving his son's life. It was the smart business move, the safe move, the kind of decision he'd made 1,000 times before when faced with potential liability. Or he could do something his wife would have done. Melissa, who'd believed in fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. Melissa, who would have been appalled that her husband could even consider abandoning someone who'd given Richard back his future. Kenny called his attorney first. I want you to hire the best medical malpractice defense team in the state. I want them on retainer for Brandy Clegg, whatever it costs. Mr. Fray, I'd advise against. I'm not asking for advice. I'm giving you instructions. He pulled up another number on his phone. And get me the hospital administrator at Northwestern. I want a meeting today. The hospital administrator was a careful man who understood the politics of major donors. Kenny was on the board of 3 hospital foundations. His annual contributions funded entire wings. When he walked into the administrator's office with his attorney in tow, the man's smile was tight with the knowledge that this conversation was going to cost something. Mr. Fray, I'm glad Richard is recovering well. Let's skip the pleasantries. Kenny sat without being invited. You're investigating Brandy Clegg for saving my son's life. I want it stopped. It's not that simple. There are legal considerations, precedents we have to protect. Here's what's going to happen. Kenny's voice was cold, the tone he used when negotiating billion-dollar contracts. You're going to close the investigation. You're going to issue a statement praising Ms. Clegg's quick thinking and life-saving intervention. And you're going to publicly acknowledge that her actions fell well within Good Samaritan protections. The administrator shifted uncomfortably. The medical board has concerns the medical board destroyed her career once based on false allegations. They're not doing it again. Kenny leaned forward. I've read the file on what happened at Cook County. Dr. Hammond made the medication error. He lied to protect himself. And you people let him because it was easier than admitting you'd made a mistake in trusting him. That's a serious accusation. It's a documented fact. My investigators found 3 other incidents where Hammond made errors and blamed subordinates. You swept all of them under the rug because he brings in research grants and has the right last name. Kenny stood. So here's the deal. You make this right with Brandy Clegg, or I make very sure that every major donor in Chicago knows how this hospital treats the people who save children's lives. Your choice. The silence that followed was the sound of a man calculating which would cost more, losing Kenny's donations or admitting the hospital had been wrong. I'll speak with the board, the administrator said finally. You'll do more than speak. You'll advocate. Loudly. Kenny moved toward the door, then stopped. And while you're at it, take another look at her original case. The state board review that's been mysteriously delayed for 2 years. I suspect if someone with authority actually pushed for a resolution, they'd find Dr. Hammond's story doesn't hold up to scrutiny. He left the administrator staring after him, then went home to his son, who was alive and laughing and asking for the woman who'd saved him. Kenny had spent 8 months hiding from his child, protecting himself from the possibility of loss by refusing to fully love what he had. He'd been a coward, and it had taken watching Richard nearly die to understand that the real risk wasn't in loving, it was in failing to fight for the people who mattered. Tomorrow he'd fight for Brandy. Tonight, he held his son and memorized the sound of his heartbeat. The letter from the Illinois State Medical Board arrived on a Tuesday in March, 3 months after Richard had stopped breathing in his crib. Brandy held the envelope in her hands for a full minute before opening it, standing in the hallway of her apartment building where her mailbox hung crooked on its hinges. She'd learned not to hope for good news. Hope was a luxury she couldn't afford, like health insurance or a future that extended beyond next month's rent. But the letter didn't say what she expected. It said her case had been reviewed by a special investigative panel. It said new evidence had come to light regarding Dr. Marcus Hammond's pattern of behavior. It said the original complaint against her had been found to be without merit. It said her medical license suspension was being lifted immediately, with a formal apology from the board and an invitation to reapply for residency positions. Brandy sat down right there in the hallway, her back against the peeling wallpaper, and read the letter 3 more times to make sure the words didn't rearrange themselves into something cruel. But they stayed the same. Her license, her career, her future, all of it handed back to her like a coat she'd hung up 2 years ago and finally been allowed to reclaim. She knew who was responsible. Kenny Fray's fingerprints were all over this. The sudden urgency of the review, the new evidence that had probably cost a fortune to compile, the way bureaucratic wheels that had been rusted solid for years had suddenly spun into motion. She should be angry about it, about the way money could reshape reality, about how justice was apparently something you could purchase if you had the right bank account. Instead, she just felt tired, and grateful, and terrified of what came next. Her phone rang that evening while she was heating up ramen, the kind that cost 39 cents and tasted like regret. Kenny's name on the screen. She deleted his number after being dismissed, but apparently he'd kept hers. Ms. Clegg. His voice was formal, careful. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. I got the letter from the medical board. Oh, good. I'm glad they moved quickly. A pause, and she could hear something in the background. Richard's voice, singing tunelessly, the sound of a child who'd forgotten he'd ever been sick. I was hoping we could meet. There's something I'd like to discuss with you. Mr. Fray, if this is about thanking me again, it's not. Well, it is, but it's more than that. Please, tomorrow afternoon, if you're available, there's someone I'd like you to meet. The someone turned out to be an architect, a woman named Sarah Chun who specialized in medical facilities and who had a portfolio that made Brandy's eyes water with its beauty, light-filled spaces that looked nothing like the institutional grimness of most hospitals, places designed to heal not just bodies but spirits. They met in Kenny's penthouse, which Brandy hadn't seen since the day she'd been dismissed. It looked different now, or maybe she was seeing it differently. The cold minimalism had been softened. There were toys scattered across the living room floor, drawings stuck to the refrigerator with magnets, signs of life that hadn't been there during her tenure. Richard was at a playdate, Kenny explained. He wanted this conversation to happen without distractions. I've purchased a building on the south side, Kenny said without preamble, pulling up architectural renderings on his tablet. 4 stories, recently renovated, zoned for medical use. I'm converting it into a community health clinic. Free care for anyone who walks through the doors. Full service, emergency medicine, primary care, pediatrics, prenatal services, mental health. Everything the neighborhood needs and can't afford. Brandy stared at the renderings, at the bright waiting rooms and modern equipment and spaces designed with dignity rather than charity. That's incredible. But I don't understand why you're telling me this. Kenny looked at her, and his expression was serious, almost nervous. Because I want you to run it. I want it to be yours. The Brandy Clegg Clinic. The words hit her like a physical force. She actually took a step back, her hand reaching for the counter to steady herself. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. You have your license back. You can complete your residency somewhere if you want. But frankly, you have more practical experience than most emergency medicine attendings half your age. I want to hire you as the medical director. Full salary, full benefits, full authority to hire your own staff and set protocols. The clinic will be yours to build however you think it should work. Kenny. The use of his first name felt strange on her tongue. Too intimate, too equal. This is insane. You can't just throw millions of dollars at a clinic because I performed CPR on your son. I'm not. He set down the tablet, and his voice was quieter now, almost vulnerable. I'm doing this because you showed me what I'd become. A man so terrified of loss that I'd already lost everything that mattered. I hired you to take care of my son so I wouldn't have to. I built walls around my life and called it protection. And when Richard needed me most, I was 30 feet away and didn't even know he was dying. That wasn't your fault. It was my choice. To stay distant. To stay safe. He moved to the window, staring out at the city sprawled below. Melissa used to talk about using our money for something meaningful. She volunteered at Cook County. Did you know that? Before Richard was born. She'd come home and tell me stories about people who waited 8 hours in the ER for care they couldn't afford, about preventable diseases that got treatment too late because there was nowhere else to go. Brandy hadn't known, but it explained something about Kenny, about the guilt that had driven him to investigate her so thoroughly, to fight for her so completely. She would have liked you, Kenny continued. She would have known immediately what I was too blind to see, that you weren't just qualified to take care of Richard, you were overqualified. That you'd been screwed over by a system that protects powerful men at the expense of talented women. That you deserve better. I don't need your guilt, Brandy said, and her voice was sharper than she intended. I don't need a pity clinic built on your dead wife's dreams and your self-flagellation about being a distant father. Kenny turned, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw him smile. A real smile, not the corporate mask. Good, because that's not what this is. This is me recognizing that you're a brilliant emergency physician who got destroyed by a corrupt system, and that you could save hundreds of lives if someone gave you the resources and got out of your way. This is me being selfish, actually. I want to live in a city where someone like you is practicing medicine instead of preparing organic snacks for rich people's children. Sarah Chun, who'd been sitting quietly reviewing renderings, looked up. If it helps, Dr. Clegg, I've worked on dozens of hospital projects. This is the first one where the benefactor has explicitly insisted on giving full control to the medical director. Mr. Fray has made it very clear that this is your clinic, your vision. He's just providing the funding and the building. Brandy's throat was tight. She looked at the renderings again, at the space that could be hers, at the possibility of doing what she'd always wanted to do. Medicine on her own terms, serving people who needed it most, building something that mattered. I don't know what to say. Say you'll think about it, Kenny said. Take your time. The building isn't going anywhere. But Brandy, he paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. You gave me my son back. Let me give you your career back. Not as payment, not as debt, but because it's right. Because you deserve it. Because the world needs doctors like you more than it. Needs another shipping logistics upgrade. Richard came home an hour later, bursting through the door with the boundless energy of a toddler who'd forgotten he'd ever been sick. When he saw Brandy, his face lit up like sunrise. Be here. He ran to her, and she caught him, lifting him up, feeling his solid weight in her arms, his heart beating steady against her chest. Hey, little man. I missed you. Missed you, he echoed, then pressed his sticky hands against her cheeks. Stay? She looked over Richard's head at Kenny, who was watching them with an expression that was impossible to read. Hope, maybe, or fear, or the beginning of something that didn't have a name yet. Yeah, buddy, she said softly. I think maybe I'll stay. 3 months later, the Brandy Clegg Clinic opened its doors on a warm June morning. The line wrapped around the block. People who'd been waiting years for accessible health care, who'd been treating chronic conditions with hope and prayer because there was no alternative, who walked through those doors and found not charity but dignity. Brandy stood in the lobby in her white coat, the one with her name embroidered on the pocket, and felt something she hadn't felt in years: purpose. The clinic was beautiful, functional, designed for the people it served. Her staff was excellent. Doctors and nurses who'd chosen to work here not for the money, which was decent but not lucrative, but for the mission. They saw patients regardless of insurance, documentation status, ability to pay. They saved lives daily. Kenny came by once a week, always with Richard, ostensibly to check on the investment, but really to see the thing his money had built. He'd started bringing Richard to the pediatric wing, letting him play with the toys in the waiting room, teaching his son that healthcare was a right, not a luxury. The distance that had defined him was gone, replaced by a man who was learning to be present, to be a father, to live in his life instead of hiding from it. They weren't master and servant anymore. They weren't quite friends, though they were moving in that direction. They were two people bound by the life of a child, by a moment when everything had hung in the balance and someone had refused to accept loss as inevitable. They were building something together, not a romance, not a fairy tale, but something better, a foundation, a future, a recognition that the most valuable things couldn't be bought but could, sometimes, be built by people willing to fight for what mattered. Richard ran between them in the clinic lobby, his laughter echoing off the high ceilings, and Brandy thought about the golden cage she'd lived in, the breath that had stopped, the choice she'd made in a nursery to use hands that had been deemed unworthy. She thought about second chances and systemic justice and the way money could be wielded as a weapon or a tool, depending on who held it. Thank you, she said to Kenny, and meant it for all of it. The investigation, the clinic, the trust, the way he'd used his power to dismantle the barriers that had been built to keep her out. Kenny just smiled, watching his son play in a clinic that existed because love and money and justice had, for once, aligned. Thank you, he said back, for everything. And in the moment before Richard called for them both, demanding they come see the fish tank in the pediatric ward, they stood together as equals, two people who'd learned that saving a life was just the beginning, and that what came after could be even more miraculous than the save itself. To all my amazing viewers, thank you. Every time you watch, like, and share my videos, you keep the echoes of love alive. Your support, your comments, and your time mean more than you know. This channel exists because of you. I appreciate you deeply.